This is the Twilight Zone, number 1. It's called The Darkness. And what's funny is, this is not something you would normally look at this and go, oh man, the Twilight Zone, man, is that a Christian preaching series we're talking about here? The Twilight Zone. What the heck is the Twilight Zone? Because we remember the show from the 60s, right? The Twilight Zone, show and all that. It was always very macabre, and there was this. And the thing is that we had to understand about the Twilight Zone is that, and first of all, we've got to understand what the Twilight is. So to understand what the Twilight Zone is, twilight is basically all the time that it is fully dark, from the time that it gets dark at night until the time that the sun rises in the morning. For all of the time that it is dark outside, that is considered twilight. And so the Twilight Zone is actually the transitionary zone where the light is overtaking the darkness in real time. If you have the right vantage point, in other words, if you could see from high above, you would see that as the sun begins to come across the surface of the earth, that the light that comes off of the sun begins to uncover the cover of darkness, and you begin to see the light overtake the darkness, and you begin to see that everywhere that once was dark immediately becomes bright, and everything that was under darkness all of a sudden becomes very visible and very transparent, easy to see. And so as that's happening, that is the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is that there's that section, that space where you're going from light into dark, light into dark. There's this zone of space where it's happening real time. It's happening rapidly, and it's happening right now. So it comes like almost suddenly. And so you're going from really dark to all of a sudden, here's the light. And that is the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is that moment when things go from being dark and having been dark all night to turning into bright and light, and all of a sudden there's this sudden brightness that comes upon you. That is the Twilight Zone. And so that is the premise. That is the premise for this entire series, is the Twilight Zone. So we're going to talk about the darkness. We're going to talk about how God, we're going to get into creation a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the things that how God how God intended for it to be, and how that correlates to a lot of other things. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So creation begins in profound darkness. So profound darkness, let's go to Genesis 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So the earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So God created this substance of earth in a raw state of potential. This massive ball of clay was undeveloped, nothingness, empty, pitch dark, void of any life moving across its surface. There was just nothing happening on the earth. No movement, there was no life, there were no people, nothing was happening. This was just darkness. I mean, pure, utter darkness. This sphere was encapsulated in the deep darkness. Surging waters is that's actually what the scriptures call it. It's called Tehom, which is the deep, which is an abyss, called an abyss, or the surging mass of water. So there was this surging mass of water, and so the waters encapsulated the entirety of the earth. And so here you had this surging darkness that was just moving around the earth in pitch dark. And so this sphere was encapsulated in this deep, dark, surging waters. In other words, all of the clay, all of the dirt, all of the things that were part of what was going to bring life and what God was going to cause, He was going to, bring Adam forward and Eve forward and all of the animals and all the people. He was going to bring them out of the clay. And all of that was actually hidden underneath an entire surface of just dark waters. So the entire surface of the earth is without reflection and the ability to see yourself. So in other words, you couldn't see anything. There was no reflection. There was zero light in the atmosphere. Zero light, and there was no universe. This is an interesting thing to really ponder and picture in creation, is to really think about the fact that there was nothing there. I mean, earth, this ball of mass, this earth with the surging waters, dark waters, and the Spirit of God hovering over the deep. This was suspended in nowhere. In other words, God said this to Job in Job 38:6. He says, "And to what were its foundations fashioned?" He was talking about earth. Or who laid its cornerstone? What is the earth fastened to? In other words, how was it held in place? This thing was just suspended in nothingness. There was no universe. There was no, vacuum. There was no anything. This was a sphere. The earth was just sitting there hanging from nothing, suspended by nothing, surrounded in water, encapsulated in the dark. There was nothing there. And so this dark, black, spherical planet that is suspended onto and fastened to nothing, there is no universe, there's no stars, no moon. The earth is positioned in nothingness. There's nothing there. It's void of all light. This is, complete and utter pitch darkness. The twilight zone is that moment of transition from darkness to light. So darkness must first entrench itself to set the scene for the light to be put on display. So in other words, you're not going to get the full display or be able to fully appreciate the light unless the backdrop or what is set forth to be contrasted by the light is the deepest, darkest sense of darkness. In other words, this is pitch dark. We're talking about not even a reflection of light. We're talking dark darkness. You can't see anything. There's just pure darkness. And this is the backdrop that God wanted to lay in place so that when he said, "Let there be light" in Genesis 1, 3, and 4, there would be a pure, honest contrast where you went from darkness to the light. You went from complete darkness, where there was absolute voidness, it was all void of light completely, to the fullness of the light. Genesis 1, 3, and 4, and then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. So God releases his light onto this dark earth to display his glory upon it. The glory of God is the true light. And here's something that's kind of a sidebar about this whole thing. God has wanted always wants to shine his glory on the earth. It's God's will to want to release his glory on the earth. God loves to take and shine his glory into the dark places, into the places where there has been no light, where there's not any even glimmer of light, and God goes in and shines his glory into the dark places. And it's the places that are the most dark on earth that recognize the light and see the contrast and fully appreciate the contrast of the light versus what they have been sitting in, right? This is in the darkness. So this is the difference between the darkness and the light. These are the things that we need to understand, because there is a true transition that takes place when you go from dark into light. And when you are going through things where you are in dark, when you are in a dark season, and then you transition into the light, there's something that happens in that. And this, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but there's something that happens in that I believe is very important for us to recognize and see and understand, that's even going to become deeper and deeper as we get into this series. 1 John 1:5. This is the message which we have heard from him and declared to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:5. This is the message you have heard from him and that we declare to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Then God divided himself as the true light from darkness and called the light good. Now, God established this distinction for men to understand. God wanted them to understand that there was a pure difference between the darkness and the light. And he wanted it to be so ingrained in our thinking that we would wake up in the morning and then we would go to bed at night, and that we would daily see the earth changing from dark to light, from dark to light. And it would become entrenched in the psyche of mankind that the light was good and that the dark was bad. And so that we would begin to understand the contrast between darkness and light. John 1 through 5. This is the very first part of John. And this may seem a little elementary, but I'm telling you, this is good. This is deep. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So this is interesting. So, because when you first see this word, you say comprehend, you're thinking, okay, so the darkness did not understand the light. You're thinking the darkness was not able to understand what the light was. That it was just more than the darkness could grasp or understand what it was. Well, the word actually comprehend here is the word katalambano. And this is what it actually means. It means to take eagerly, that is to seize, to possess, to apprehend, to attain, to come upon, to comprehend, to find, obtain, or perceive, or to overtake. In other words, the darkness was unable to overtake. The darkness was unable to seize or apprehend the light. The darkness is unable to get its arms around and grab the light. It was not able to take, and the darkness is unable to defeat the light. It's unable to possess it, apprehend it, to overtake it, to seize it. The darkness has to succumb to the light. That when the light shines onto the darkness, that the darkness has to dissipate, that the darkness has to disappear, that the light makes the darkness go away, that the light causes the darkness to flee, that the light causes darkness to move away. It doesn't have the ability not to comprehend or understand the light, but it doesn't have the ability to seize it or possess it or apprehend it. In other words, the darkness cannot defeat the light, cannot grab a hold of the light, can't hold the light down, cannot in any way gain the upper hand over the light. The darkness cannot overcome the light. And this is what he's saying, that he, Jesus, was the light of man, and that he shines in the darkness, and that the darkness cannot seize it, possess it, apprehend it, overcome it. That the light that when the light comes, that the darkness has to back away and dissipate. So, the darkness cannot seize it, possess it, overcome it, apprehend it. So we see that. The darkness cannot comprehend the glory of the light. Well, the light overtakes the darkness. The transition, this is the transition again, the transition between the darkness to the light is the twilight zone. And so when you come out from the effects of the dark, there is something that happens in all that. There's something that happens when there's a transition where you have been dealing with the darkness. You've been dealing with and wrestling with the darkness. You've been in a season of darkness. You've been going through a dark day, let's say, or a dark season, or a darkness where there's been a darkness that's been resting on you, or on your life, or on the things around you, and you've been dealing with the dark. And there's a time where the darkness, when there's a transition where God comes along and brings the light. And there's that transition, that moment when you go from the dark to the light. There's that moment where you go from dark to light. And there's something that happens in your mind where you have to adjust for a minute. It's not something where you just go right with the light. It's like all of a sudden you're like, okay, wait a minute. I've been dealing with the dark for a long time. And now the light has come. And now I'm having to adjust to the fact that the light's here. And what does that mean to me? And how does that mean to my situation? Because I've been enduring all of this time. I'm not trying to get completely ahead of myself, but we're getting there. So then here we are now in day 4. So what's an interesting thing is that when God says let there be light, that was his own light. That was the light of the glory of God. That was not the light coming from the sun. It's not until day 4, where we're getting ready to read here, that God actually creates the sun, the moon, the stars, and the universe. Up until this point in creation, the first 3 days of creation, we have a solid mass that has been suspended on nothingness, fastened to nothingness, hanging in the midst of nothingness. I mean, there is nothing else created. There is no universe. There is no other substance. There is no other mass. There is nothing else. It is just being held there by the hand of God, by the will of God, suspended and fastened to nothing. So here we are. Now we get to verse 4. To verse 16, and this is day 4. And God says, and then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light to the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Verse 9, so the sun provides a light that is similar to God. This is interesting stuff. So the sun provides a light that's similar to God and gives man a light that they can use to compare to the brightness of God's glory. So now here God's giving them something that has a likeness, because before that man didn't have anything to compare that to. So now when we look at the sun come up every day and it lights up the entire world, or at least half of the world at once, and we see the sun is a big deal to the earth, and we see it, well, man, it's shining light on half of the earth, and it comes along, and the entire earth revolves around the sun. And there's this correlation that we begin to pick up and realize that God is showing us a type of glory so that we might have something to compare it to that's kind of in between, so that we can recognize the greatness of the glory of God when we try to compare it to the sun, and we realize that the greatness of the glory of God is much higher than the glory of the sun, but at least we have something to compare it to. It gives us a relationship to compare in our own minds. And so the glory of God can only be quantified in comparison to other lights, or in contrast to the dark. So the glory of God, and if all we had ever known was the glory of God, but we had not known with, or at least become acquainted with the darkness, we would not fully appreciate the glory of God, because that would be all that we ever known. So to us, the glory of God would be common. The glory of God would be a common, though it would be great and be wonderful, it would be common. So it would not be as appreciated as one who once dwelt in the light. I mean, in the darkness, had come out of the darkness and into the light, and now all of a sudden that glory of that light is so much more magnificent in the backdrop of knowing I once walked in the dark, and now I am walking in the light, and now my life is not the same as it once was, because the light has changed my life. And so there's a contrast. Understanding to quantify the glory of God, we must at least have experienced the darkness. Perhaps this might give some revelation as to why Adam and Eve fell in the garden. It's like, because all they had ever known was communion with God. All they had ever known was God was good. They had never known what it was like to understand what it's like to sit under the weight of the guilt of sin, and to understand what it means to sit in the darkness, to understand how profoundly dark it feels to be in the dark. And so all they'd ever known was the goodness of God, the connection and the communion with God. They never knew that they could be a different way. So here we are. So that's how it's quantified. So without the dark, the light becomes common. And without something to compare things to, without a relationship, that's why, like, even when you look at the things of the Spirit, what does God say? God says that what did Paul say? Paul said that we compare spiritual things with other spiritual things. Because unless you have something to compare it to or to relate it to, sometimes spiritual things don't really relate with the things of the natural. They don't really relate with the things that you see on a daily basis. The things that are spiritual are to be compared with other spiritual things, and that's how they help you to quantify them. So anyway, so let's move forward here. So night and day were established and set in motion by God. God set the earth to rotate on its axis and transition daily from darkness to light. And you can literally see the light overtake the dark upon the earth's surface. And that, again, is the Twilight Zone. So the Twilight Zone represents that point where your mind and spirit has been enduring the dark season, and now the light is illuminating the darkness. The light is now illuminating the darkness. So let's look at a little bit about how the dark affects us. Darkness affects how our eyes see and can play tricks with your mind, with your eyes. Darkness can affect your emotions. It can make it hard to assess threats in your surroundings. Darkness tends to provoke fear. So the darkness requires an adjustment of us. We have to find our bearings when we find ourselves in the dark. And the longer that we are in the dark, the more that we have to adjust to the darkness to be able to function under the darkness. So while the darkness is moving around, has overtaken things, we have to adjust and make certain adjustments to deal with the fact that we are walking in darkness, that we are living in darkness and dwelling in darkness and dealing with the darkness in the way we function. The same thing happens when you're in a season of spiritual darkness or dark days. The weight of the darkness of the spiritual warfare is intense, sometimes beyond words. And so sitting under the weight of that spiritual darkness, sitting under the weight of that dark time or that dark season, causes you to have to adjust. You have to come to terms with things. You have to deal with, how am I going to sit under the weight of this darkness for this dark season? You adjust so that you can continue to walk in victory, so that you can continue to walk in peace, so that you can continue to function and do the things that you need to do. You're dealing with a spiritual warfare. You're dealing with a spiritual darkness, and you're trying to deal with that, and you have to make adjustments, and you have to toughen up, and you have to be stronger, and you have to deal with the fact that things are tough, that there's a weightiness to the warfare. There's a weightiness to the darkness. There's a weightiness to the difficulty. A weightiness to it. And it affects your perception. It affects your faith. It affects your hope. And sometimes it makes you forget things that you already knew when it was light outside. Something about the darkness that causes us to forget what we knew, where everything was, where we sat things before, where we remember what we've sat in the side of the garage, or what we put in the backyard, or where things were positioned. It's like all of a sudden the dark causes us to forget things that we know that we knew before. And so there's something about the effects of darkness that we have to adjust to. Well, how does the light impact the dark? When the light comes, and there's that transition point. Well, what happens now? Now, here we are, the sun rises. Now you've been in this dark season all night, and you have had to adjust. Now you have to adjust to the light. So your eyes start to refocus. You start to transition to living in the freedom of the light. All of a sudden here it's like sunrise, right? It's like it's the dawn. And here you go, the light's starting to shine. Man, it's like all of a sudden you're starting to make out all the things in your front yard, in your backyard, and start all the things that you're seeing the neighborhood light up. You can see your neighbor's car. And now all of a sudden, your eyes are refocusing, and now you're starting to have to deal with the fact that now I'm not in the dark anymore. The light's here. The light's here. Wow. Okay. So now all the things that were on your mind when it was dark, when you were under the weight of spiritual warfare, when you were under the weight of darkness, when things were difficult, all the things that were really weighing on your mind, all of a sudden in the light, it's almost like they don't have the same weight. It's like they didn't have the same oomph to them. It's like all of a sudden, it's like you start to get some perspective, it seems like. The light reveals evidence of things that were done during the night, because the darkness the cover of darkness is being lifted. So whatever was happening during the darkness, right? Those things are exposed. In other words, people who are running amok and doing bad things in the middle of the night, you come and you see little things, little evidence, maybe down the street or up the street. You can see that people were up to no good, or people were doing things under the cover of darkness. And you know, it's the same thing that goes on when you are in spiritual warfare, and all of a sudden the light comes forward and you get your breakthrough, and whatever was weighing you down and whatever was difficult season that you were going through, man, as the weight of that lifts, it's like all of a sudden you began to realize the things that were going on, the things that were happening, the things that were happening in the spirit realm, the things that were happening while you were under the cover of darkness. There were so many different things happening, and you didn't even really completely comprehend all of it. And it's not until the light comes that all of a sudden you begin to see, like, oh, that's what was going on. That's what was happening. And you begin to have revelation and understanding of what was happening, and perhaps even what the source of it was. You might have felt the need to close the curtains during the dark, lock the door, ready yourself for the night season. There's something about the darkness and the darkness that makes you feel like you need to lock the doors and you need to be ready, because you're going to endure the night. You're going to endure the twilight. You're going to endure this season of darkness. And so there's something about getting ready for it, like you gear up for it. Man, I'm dealing with this season of darkness. And then there's something about the light that brings a certain peace. And that peace comes, and all of a sudden you don't feel like all that stuff was as important as you felt like it was in the dark. So this is the thing, the contrast between the darkness and the light. And this is where the Twilight Zone comes from. So the morning brings a lightness of spirit, as it becomes evident that the light has brought you forward and it has brought you forward through the darkness. So now you're beginning to recognize that this is the faithfulness of God. Now you begin to realize, here comes the light now. Here's the faithfulness of the light, because God always comes through. It's like there's always that newness that comes every morning. There's that his mercies are new every morning, and you realize here comes the light. Here comes God in his faithfulness to do what he always does. Here's God coming through when things were so dark and so desperate seemingly at certain points in time in life. And here is God coming along in his faithfulness and his love, and shines a light in your dark season. And all of a sudden you're like, here we go. It's like all of a sudden you realize that God has brought me forward from the darkness. God has brought me forward through the dark season. God has brought me forward out of these difficult times. God has brought me forward. I'm moving forward into the new things that God has for me. He's ordered a new set of footsteps for me to walk in, moving forward. And there's a new season, a new day, and a new hope, and a new faith for tomorrow, because here God has brought me a season of mercy. In the midst of my dark season, God has come and shed light and brought his light and his mercy and his glory on my new season. And here's this transition. You're going from fighting through and surviving the darkness to now here's that newness of light. Here's the lightness that brings all of the weight of the darkness and begins to dissipate. And the morning brings this lightness of spirit that becomes evident. It becomes so evident that you have been brought forward. Psalms 30 verse 5 says, "For his anger is but for a moment, but his favor is for life. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning." Every good and perfect gift, every perfect gift is from above. It comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. You can always count on the fact that God will always be in the light. You can count on the fact that, because, like that scripture I read earlier, it says that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. He is the Father of light. So we know that when God is coming, we know that we will find him in light, and there will be no darkness in his favor at all. Everything that he brings will be in fullness of light. And so you will recognize that is where God is coming from. And what we have to understand is there's that transition. It's like where you go from, here's that time where you learned how to stand in the midst of the darkness. And now you're being brought forward into God's favor. The light of God is there. You're being released from your season of darkness, and it takes a minute for you to let go and realize, okay, I'm not in the middle of spiritual warfare right now. Okay, I'm not in the middle of my dark season anymore. Okay, I'm not in the midst of the darkness. I'm not in the midst of the dark right now. I don't have to endure. I don't have to stand therefore anymore. I can just rest in this new season. I can rest in the peace of God and the glory of God and the love of God. I can rest in this because God has brought me forward. And it takes a minute for you to let that go. It takes a minute for you to realize that, oh yeah, it's the dawn. It's the dawn's early light. It's God has brought a newness and the freshness of the morning. And this is the twilight zone. There is those times where all of a sudden there's a suddenly where the light comes and shines in your dark season. And sometimes some of us have gone through some really dark seasons in life. Some of us have gone through some profoundly dark seasons in life. Some of us are still dealing with the residue or the residuals of some of the darkness that we've gone through in life. And this is the thing, that there is a newness to this whole thing. There is a transition that takes place where the light begins to come and bring you forward out of that season and propelled you out of that season, even to the point where, and I'll close with this, when God told Joshua, he said that the reproach of Egypt has been rolled away from you today, and he's talking about Israel. He says the reproach of Egypt has been rolled away from you. There comes a time and a season when even the most excruciatingly difficult, hurtful times in life, the most darkest of times, there comes a time where God has worked it out with you, worked it out, shined light here, shined light there, and eventually brings you forward. And there's a time where you can turn the page and you can say goodbye to the old days and the things that hurt you and the things that you went through, and you can move forward into his marvelous light and let the past go and let the new day begin. Amen. So I just wanted to share that with you. This is our first installment of the Twilight Zone, and so I felt like I wanted to set the tone for this. I've got a really good one for you guys next week. I think you guys are going to really dig that one. That's going to kind of build on to this one a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit more about science. We're going to talk a little bit more about the spirit realm and stuff like that. So anyway, I bless you guys. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer. Father, I just pray, God, have your way with my friends out there, God, those that popped on and watched